It takes exactly 3 minutes to ruin 2 lives. 1 minute to sign the registry. 1 minute to realize you are tethered to a stranger forever. And 1 minute to turn your back and walk out the church doors, leaving a blind woman standing alone at the altar. The air in Lady Crawford's ballroom tasted of stale gin, powdered sweat, and desperation. Owen Patrick, Duke of Wrotham, stood near the edge of the dance floor, his spine rigid against the gilded plaster of the wall. He held a crystal glass of whiskey he had no intention of drinking. It was merely a prop, something to keep his hands from trembling. At 26, Owen possessed the kind of sharp, cold features that poets routinely lied about, calling them noble. There was nothing noble about him. His wealth was vast, his tailors were exceptional, and his title was older than the king. But beneath the velvet and the starch of his cravat, he was a hollow, rotting thing. He knew it. The worst part was that society knew it too, and they simply did not care. "Wrotham, you look as though you're preparing for a funeral," a voice slurred to his left. Lord Henry Talbot, a man whose primary occupation was losing his father's money at cards. "I am," Owen replied flatly, his gaze fixed on a chandelier that burned too brightly. "I am burying my tolerance for this conversation." Talbot snorted, unoffended, and drifted away toward a cluster of debutantes. Owen watched him go, feeling a familiar, heavy exhaustion settle in his chest. 3 years. It had been exactly 3 years to the day. Owen closed his eyes and the suffocating heat of the ballroom vanished. He was back in St. George's Chapel. The air was frigid, smelling of damp stone and wilting white lilies. He was 23, drowning in the colossal debts his late father had left behind. The dukedom had been weeks away from bankruptcy, the ancestral estates ready to be carved up and sold to the highest bidder. Then came the Penelope offer. Thomas Penelope was a merchant who had made a grotesque fortune in textiles. He wanted a coronet for his daughter, but there was a catch. Arria Penelope was blind. A childhood fever had stolen her sight, leaving her eyes the color of clouded milk. Society shunned her. Her father, desperate for legitimacy, had essentially bought Owen. Owen had agreed. He had stood in the cold church, the registry already signed. They were legally bound. He watched Arria step up to the altar. She was 19, frail, trembling under the weight of a heavy lace veil. She held a white cane in one hand, her knuckles white, tapping the edge of the stone steps to find her footing. Tap, tap, tap. The priest had begun the final blessing, and Owen had looked at her. Really looked at her. He didn't see a wife. He saw a lifetime of dependency. He saw a helpless creature who would rely on him for every step, every meal, every reassurance, when he could not even rely on himself. He was a boy playing at being a duke, terrified, drowning, and entirely inadequate. The panic hadn't just gripped him, it had swallowed him whole. So he did the unforgivable. He took a step backward, then another. He didn't say a word. He just turned, the echo of his boots ringing out against the stone arches, cutting through the priest's droning voice. He walked down the aisle, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and ran. He left his bride standing in the shadows, listening to the fading sound of her new husband's retreat. He paid the debts with the money Penelope had transferred upon the signing of the registry. He sent letters of apology. He sent drafts of repayment with interest. They were returned unopened. Within a month, Thomas Penelope died of an apoplexy. When Owen tried to locate Arria to annul the marriage or settle a permanent estate upon her, he found the London house empty. She had vanished. The Ton forgave Owen. They whispered that Penelope had tricked him, that no duke should be saddled with a defective bride. They welcomed him back to their card tables and their daughter's dance cards. But Owen never forgave himself. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the tap of her cane. The orchestra struck up a waltz, jarring him back to the present. The cloying scent of jasmine perfume from a passing dowager made his stomach pitch. He needed air, He set his untouched whiskey on a passing footman's tray and pushed his way through the velvet curtains, escaping into the shadowed corridors of the Crawford estate. He walked blindly, seeking the one place in these massive London homes where people rarely went: the conservatory. The air inside the glass-domed room was thick with the smell of damp earth, crushed ferns, and blooming night orchids. It was significantly cooler here, the glass panes rattling faintly under the assault of a sudden, sharp London rain. Owen loosened his cravat, taking a ragged breath. The silence was an absolute relief. He leaned his head against the cool iron of a pillar, closing his eyes. "If you are going to be sick, Your Grace, I ask that you do it near the hydrangeas. They thrive in acidic soil." Owen snapped his head up. In the far corner, tucked into a high-backed wicker chair, sat a woman. The only light came from the moon, bleeding through the rain-streaked glass ceiling. She wore a dress of dark, muted green, a color designed to disappear in the shadows. A heavy woolen shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders. In her lap lay a book, which she closed with a soft, decisive snap. She did not look at him. Her face was turned sharply toward the glass wall, presenting him only with the rigid, elegant line of her jaw and a mass of dark hair pinned up with ruthless efficiency. Owen straightened, instantly defensive. "I did not see you there. Forgive the intrusion." "An intrusion implies I claim ownership of the room," the woman said. Her voice was striking. It was low, raspy, lacking the breathless, high-pitched cadence fashionable among the women of the ton. It sounded like a voice that had done a great deal of screaming in a past life and had settled into a comfortable, hardened cynicism. "I am merely borrowing the shadows. You are welcome to the ones on the left." Owen took a step closer, curiosity piercing through his melancholy. "You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are, Duke of Wrotham," she replied smoothly. She still did not turn her head. Her gaze remained fixed on the rain sliding down the glass. "You carry the scent of expensive guilt and cheap whiskey wherever you go." Owen stopped dead, a muscle feathered in his jaw. "You have a sharp tongue, madam. Do you always speak to your betters with such reckless abandon?" A dry, harsh laugh escaped her. It was entirely devoid of humor. "My betters? Tell me, Your Grace, what exactly makes you better? Your blood, your tailor, or your unparalleled ability to run away from things that frighten you?" The words struck him like a physical blow. The air in his lungs vanished. How much did she know? Everyone knew the scandal, but few dared mention it to his face, let alone with such surgical precision. He walked around the perimeter of the room, intending to step into her line of sight, to see the face of a woman brave enough to insult a duke in the dark. But as he moved to her right, she casually shifted in her chair, turning her head further away, raising the collar of her shawl to obscure her profile. "Do not move into my light," she commanded, her voice suddenly edged with steel. "There is barely any light," Owen pointed out, stopping. "Why will you not look at me?" "Because looking at you would require acknowledging you as a man deserving of my attention," she said quietly. "And frankly, I find the rain far more compelling." Owen should have left. He was a duke. He did not tolerate insolence. But there was a gravity to her, a heavy, unyielding presence that rooted him to the stone floor. She wasn't playing a game of coquetry. There was no coy fan fluttering, no giggling. She genuinely did not want to look at him. It was a novelty. It was intoxicating. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice dropping in volume. "I am a guest of Lady Crawford's cousin," she answered, tracing the embossed cover of her book with a gloved finger. "A spinster companion. A ghost in the wallpaper. Pick whichever title offends your aristocratic sensibilities the least. A ghost with a very loud voice. Only when provoked by cowards." Owen flinched. He looked down at his polished boots. "You speak of my past. I speak of your nature," she corrected. "People do not change, Your Grace. They merely find better suits to wear over their rot. You judge a man on a single act, Owen said, the defense tearing out of him before he could stop it. A moment of panic, a mistake. For the first time, she moved. Her hand gripped the armrest of the wicker chair. The leather of her glove strained. A mistake, she echoed. The word seemed to coat her tongue in ash. Dropping a teacup is a mistake, leaving a blind girl standing at an altar, listening to the footsteps of the only man in the world, sworn to protect her, fade away into silence. That is not a mistake. That is a revelation of character. Owen felt his throat tighten. I was 23. She was 19. I was terrified. She was blind. The sudden raise in her voice cracked like a whip in the damp air. She caught herself pulling a slow, measured breath in through her nose. She pressed a hand to her temple, still keeping her face averted. Your fear is not an excuse. It is merely the weapon you used to cut her down. Owen stood in the silence that followed, listening to the rain. He had expected anger from society 3 years ago, but he had received absolution. Now, from a stranger in the dark, he was finally receiving his execution. It felt like a bizarre, twisted relief. You are right, Owen said softly. I have no defense. The woman stiffened. She seemed unprepared for his surrender. If I could find her, Owen continued, staring at the back of her head, at the stray curl resting against her white neck. If I knew where she went, I would spend the rest of my life making amends. But her family vanished. The money I sent to her solicitor sits untouched in an account. She does not want your money, the woman said, her voice dropping to a low whisper. How do you know? Because a woman who has been stripped of her dignity rarely trades it back for silver. She stood up. She kept her back to him, gathering her shawl. Do not look for her, Your Grace. Leave her to her peace. It is the only decent thing you can do. She walked toward the secondary exit of the conservatory, her skirts rustling over the stone floor. She moved with a strange, deliberate care, her steps measured, her hand trailing lightly over the edges of the planters, as if mapping the room. Owen watched her disappear into the corridor, leaving behind only the scent of rain and a heavy, brutal truth. Owen became a haunted man. For the next 3 weeks, the London season blurred into a meaningless parade of silk and candlelight. He attended every ball, every theater premiere, every dull poetry reading he would have previously avoided. He was hunting for the woman in the green dress. He learned her name from a loose-lipped footman. Miss Clara Hayes. She was a distant cousin of the Crawford family, a woman of no fortune who had spent the last few years on the continent. She was considered an eccentric. She rarely danced. She wore dark, severe colors, and she had a reputation for driving away suitors with a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. Owen sought her out constantly, and every time he found her, the ritual was the same. At a garden party in Hyde Park, he approached her beneath the shade of an elm tree. She immediately raised a broad-brimmed parasol, tilting it to obscure her face entirely, offering him only the sight of her gloved hands resting in her lap. At the King's Theatre, he slipped into the back of her box during the second act of a tragic opera. She turned her chair a quarter-inch toward the stage, raising her playbill to shield her profile, speaking to him only in hushed, biting whispers, without ever breaking her gaze from the performers. She was infuriating. She was brilliant. She systematically dismantled every defense, every excuse, every piece of aristocratic arrogance Owen had built around himself. And Owen, to his own shock, craved it. He had spent 3 years surrounded by sycophants who told him he was a good man. Clara Hayes was the only person alive who looked at the wreckage of his soul, or rather refused to look at it, and told him he was a monster. It felt like penance. It was a Tuesday evening, during a stifling dinner party at Lord Harrington's estate, when the breaking point arrived. Owen had managed to corner her on the stone terrace overlooking the hedge maze. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening rain. Clara was backed against the stone balustrade. For the first time, she had nowhere to turn, no fan to raise, no parasol to hide behind. Instead, she simply closed her eyes and turned her head sharply away, facing the wind. "This game is exhausting, Clara," Owen said, stepping close enough to smell the lavender soap on her skin. He had dropped the titles weeks ago. "Then stop playing it, Owen," she snapped, her eyes remaining shut tight, her chin jutting out defiantly. "Go back inside. Find a debutante who will bat her eyelashes and tell you how broad your shoulders are." "I don't want a debutante. I want you to look at me." "I will not." "Why?" His voice broke slightly, the frustration boiling over into something desperate. "You have lectured me. You have condemned me. You have gutted me with words. Do you not have the courage to look me in the eye while you do it?" Her hands gripped the stone edge of the balustrade behind her. Her knuckles were stark white. "Courage? You speak to me of courage? Look at me." "No." Owen stepped closer. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and cold, hitting the stone between them. "I am trying to be a better man," he said, his voice dropping to a raw plea. "You make me want to be better, but you treat me like a ghost. You treat me like I am a disease." "You are a disease," she hissed. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. "You infect everything you touch. You make promises and you break them. You leave people in the dark." "I left one person in the dark," Owen argued, the guilt twisting like a knife in his gut. "And I will burn in hell for it. But I am not that boy anymore. I have changed." "You haven't!" she shouted. Her voice cracked, a sound so full of pure, unadulterated agony that Owen physically recoiled. The rain began to fall harder, slicking her dark hair against her cheeks. She was trembling. "You think you have changed because you feel sorry for yourself," Clara said, her voice shaking violently. "You think guilt is the same as redemption. It isn't. Guilt is just self-pity in a finer coat. Did you ever wonder what happened to her after you ran?" Owen swallowed hard. "I tried to find out." "Did you wonder how she got out of the church?" Clara demanded, her eyes still squeezed shut, her face turned away. She couldn't see Owen. She didn't know the layout of the chapel. Her father was so humiliated, he stormed out and left her there. She had to crawl down the steps in a wedding dress. She had to feel her way along the stone walls, listening to the pitying whispers of the servants. She scraped her hands to bleeding on the iron gates. Owen felt the blood drain from his face. The world tilted. His stomach heaved. How could you know that?" Clara ignored the question. "She went to Paris," she continued, her voice turning hard, robotic, reciting a nightmare. "She found a surgeon, a butcher really, a man who promised to cut the clouds from her eyes. Do you know what they do to a conscious woman when they take a scalpel to her eyes, Owen? They strap her down. They strap her to a wooden chair so she cannot thrash." "Stop," Owen whispered, horrified. "She suffered through hell," Clara said, a tear finally breaking free, sliding down her cheek to mix with the rain. For a year she lived with bandages over her face, praying in the dark, and when they took them off, she could see. She could see the dirt on the streets. She could see the color of the sky. And she could see her own face in the mirror, a face her husband couldn't bear to look at. Owen couldn't breathe. The air was gone. His mind was spinning, connecting fragments of the past 3 weeks. The measured way she walked, the way she touched the edges of tables before sitting, the way she never looked at him. He didn't think. He reached out and grabbed her shoulders. She flinched violently, crying out, but Owen did not let go. He pulled her gently but firmly away from the stone edge. He forced her to face him. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice trembling. "Let me go," she sobbed, fighting against his grip, keeping her chin tucked down. "Look at me." With a sudden, violent jerk, she wrenched her head up. Her eyes snapped open. Owen froze. The rain washed over her face, clearing away the shadows. The bone structure, the sharp cheekbones, the delicate curve of her nose, he recognized it. But it was the eyes that stopped his heart. 3 years ago they had been a milky, lifeless white. Now staring back at him in the gloomy light of the storm, they were a piercing, vibrant, devastating hazel. They were clear. They were focused. and they were staring at him with a hatred so profound it seemed to burn the air between them. "Hello, Owen," Arya said, her voice dropping the rasp of Clara to reveal the soft, broken tone of the girl he had abandoned. "Do you see me now?" The rain washed the soot from the London sky, pouring over them in sheets, but Owen could not feel the cold. He could only see her eyes, hazel, bright, stripped of the milky fog that had once obscured them. They were terrifyingly clear, and they were fixed directly on his face, studying the lines of his jaw, the cut of his cheekbones, the absolute paralyzing horror written across his expression. Arya Penelope did not blink. She let him look. She let the silence stretch until the weight of it threatened to snap the stone beneath their feet. "You," Owen breathed. The word barely made it past his teeth. It sounded like a dying man's last exhale. "Me," she replied. Her voice was terrifyingly calm now, the screaming agony of a moment ago packed away beneath a layer of fresh ice. She reached up and shoved his hands off her shoulders. The movement was sharp, efficient. She didn't stumble. 3 years, Owen. You ran from a blind girl. You spent weeks pursuing a woman in the dark, and now here we are, in the light. Tell me, do I still frighten you?" Owen took a step back. His boots slipped slightly on the wet slate. He felt physically ill. The world had tilted violently off its axis, leaving him unanchored. "Arya, God, Arya, I—" "Do not," she interrupted, raising a gloved hand. The wet leather gleamed in the dim light pouring from the terrace doors. "Do not dare insult me with an apology. I did not endure the knife, the darkness, and the agony of recovery to listen to the Duke of Wrotham say he is sorry." "Why did you come back?" he asked. The question tore out of him, ragged and bleeding. "If you survived, if you got your sight, why come back to London? Why play this game with me?" Arya laughed. The sound was brittle, entirely devoid of joy. She turned slightly, looking out over the manicured hedges of Harrington's estate, watching the rain hammer the roses into the mud. "I did not come back for you," she said, her voice dropping to a conversational murmur that cut deeper than any shout. "I came back because this is my country too. Because my father bought me a title with his life's blood, and I was tired of living like a fugitive in Paris while my coward of a husband danced in Mayfair." She turned her head back to him. The rain had plastered her dark hair to her skull, ruining the elaborate pinning of the Crawford maid. But she had never looked more formidable. "I wanted to see you," she said simply. "That was the great irony of my recovery. For a year, while I sat in a pitch-black room with bandages wrapped around my skull, listening to my own heartbeat, the only face I tried to imagine was yours. The man who owned me. The man who threw me away. I wanted to see the monster." Owen swallowed. His throat felt lined with broken glass. "And now I see a pathetic, ordinary man," she said. There was no venom left in her tone, just exhaustion. "A man who drinks too much to sleep. A man who seeks out punishment from a stranger in a conservatory because he lacks the spine to punish himself." She stepped closer to him. Owen froze, his breath catching in his lungs. She didn't reach for him, but she stood near enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her skin in the freezing rain. "I made you look at me," Owen whispered, the memory of his demand, moments earlier turning his stomach. "Yes," Arya said softly. "You did. You demanded I look at you, so look at me, Owen. Look at the woman you created." He did. He looked at the harsh set of her jaw, the defensive posture of her shoulders, the brutal intelligence in her eyes that had replaced the soft, terrified innocence of the 19-year-old girl at the altar. He had done this. He had not just abandoned a wife. He had forged a weapon. "I deserve every word," Owen said, his voice cracking. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to explain the terror of a 23-year-old boy drowning in debt. It didn't matter, not in the face of her reality. "I am the monster in your dark, I accept that. But Arya, if there is anything on this earth that I can do to give you peace, you can give me my life back, she said instantly. But you cannot do that, because we are bound by the church and the state. So I will settle for your absence. Keep your money, keep your name, just stay out of my sight. She turned away, her wet skirts heavy with mud and water, and walked back toward the glass doors of the terrace. She didn't tap a cane. She didn't falter. She walked with the precise, punishing grace of a woman who had taught herself how to navigate a world that actively tried to destroy her. Owen stood in the rain, watching the glass doors shut behind her. He didn't follow. He knew with absolute certainty that if he took one step toward her, he would be doing it for himself, to ease his own guilt, to beg for a forgiveness she owed him nothing of. For the first time in his life, Owen Patrick did not run. He stayed exactly where he was, letting the storm batter him, accepting the cold, hollow ruin of the bed he had made. It took 3 weeks to dismantle a dukedom. Owen did not return to the Crawford ball that night. He went straight to his townhouse, locked himself in his study, and sent for his solicitors. When they arrived at dawn, clutching briefcases and looking thoroughly irritated by the ungodly hour, Owen gave them their instructions. They thought he was mad. They argued. They cited precedent, property laws, and the sacred, unbreakable nature of a high society marriage. Owen poured them each a glass of port, sat behind his mahogany desk, and told them that if they did not do exactly as he asked, he would find someone who would. He did not attend the theater. He did not go to his club. He stopped drinking. He sat in his quiet house and spent every waking hour signing away the privileges he had spent his life hiding behind. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he finally found her again. The Crawford estate was in chaos, the family preparing to leave for their country home. Trunks lined the marble foyer. Servants scurried like ants with a disrupted nest. Owen bypassed the butler, ignoring the man's sputtered protests, and walked straight up the main staircase. He knew where she would be. She liked the quiet. He found her in the library. Arya was standing by the tall, arched windows, wearing a simple, traveling dress of navy wool. The room smelled of old paper and dust. She was holding a leather-bound volume of poetry, reading the text with a quiet, fierce concentration. She didn't need to trace the spine. She just read the words. Owen stopped in the doorway. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a heavy leather portfolio clutched in his right hand. Arya turned the page. "You breathe too loudly for a man attempting to be stealthy, Owen." She didn't look up from the book. "I wasn't trying to be stealthy," Owen said. His voice was steady. The panic that usually accompanied her presence was gone, replaced by a strange, hollow calm. "I am here to give you something. Then I will leave." She finally looked up. Her hazel eyes were guarded, her jaw tight. She closed the book, setting it on the windowsill. "I told you I did not want your money." "It isn't money," Owen said. He walked across the room, stopping a polite 5 feet away from her. He placed the heavy leather portfolio on the mahogany reading table between them. 3 years ago, you signed a piece of paper in the dark. You didn't know what it looked like. You just had to trust the men in the room telling you where to put the pen. I imagine that was terrifying. Arya stared at him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. Owen unclasped the portfolio. He drew out a thick stack of vellum documents, covered in dense, elegant, legal script. The wax seals at the bottom were heavy and red. He turned them around, sliding them across the polished wood toward her. "Read them," Owen said gently. "Take your time." Arya looked at the papers, then up at him. Suspicion radiated from her posture. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the top document. She didn't touch them at first. She just leaned over, reading the script. The silence in the library was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Owen watched her eyes dart back and forth across the page. He watched her chest rise and fall, He watched the exact moment her breath hitched, her hand flying up to grip the edge of the table. "This is a petition for an annulment," she whispered. Her voice shook. "It is," Owen confirmed. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "On what grounds? The church does not grant annulments to dukes simply because they ask. They do when the duke signs a sworn affidavit admitting to non-consummation, gross negligence, and abandonment," Owen said evenly. "And they are particularly amenable when said duke donates a substantial sum to the archbishop's discretionary fund." Aria looked back down at the papers. She flipped to the second page, then the third. "You transferred the deed to the Penelope textile factories back to my name. You surrendered the dowry. Owen, this is half your liquid fortune." "It is exactly what your father paid to save my estate," Owen corrected, "with 3 years of interest. You are bankrupting yourself." "No, I will have to sell the London house, and perhaps the hunting lodge in Scotland. The ancestral estate remains. I will have to actually manage it now, rather than paying men to ignore it." Owen stepped back, putting another foot of distance between them. "I stole your choices, Arya. I traded your father's money for my comfort, and I left you to bear the humiliation alone. I cannot undo the surgery. I cannot undo the fear." He pointed to the final page, where a space remained blank beside his own rigid signature. "Oh, but I can give you the pen and the light," Owen said. "If you sign that, you are free. You are Arya Penelope again, an heiress of independent means. You will never have to look at me, hear my name, or share my shadows ever again." Arya stared at the blank line. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingertips tracing the ink of his signature. It was stark. Final. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "A month ago you were hunting me through ballrooms, demanding I acknowledge you." "A month ago I was still trying to save myself," Owen said. He offered a small, self-deprecating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You were right, Arya. Guilt is just self-pity in a finer coat. I didn't want to make amends. I wanted you to absolve me so I could sleep at night." He looked at the window, at the gray London sky. "But I saw you on that terrace," he continued, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. "I saw the woman who survived me. And I realized that the only way to truly prove I am not the coward who ran from you is to be the man who lets you go." Arya stood paralyzed. She looked from the papers to the man standing before her. He looked older. The arrogance that usually sat on his shoulders like a mantle was gone, leaving behind a man who was tired, stripped bare, and waiting for the axe to fall. She reached for the silver fountain pen, resting in the inkwell on the desk. Owen felt a physical pain in his chest, sharp and bright, but he kept his face impassive. He watched her uncap the pen. He watched her lean over the document. She held the nib an inch above the heavy vellum. She stared at the blank line. One stroke of the pen. That was all it took. 1 minute to sign the registry 3 years ago. 1 minute to dissolve it now. Arya stood there for a long time. The grandfather clock ticked. The dust motes danced in the pale light. Then, very slowly, she capped the pen. She set it down on the table with a soft, metallic click. Owen stopped breathing. He stared at the pen, then up at her face. "Arya, if I sign this," she said, her voice quiet but iron strong, "I am a spinster with a fortune. Society will tolerate me, but they will whisper. They will say I was too broken for a duke. I will publicly take the blame," Owen said instantly. "I have already drafted the statement." "I don't care about the statement, Owen," she snapped, a flash of her old fire returning. She picked up the annulment papers. The thick vellum rustled in her hands. "I care about the fact that for 3 years, I let you dictate the shape of my life. You made me a victim. You made me a tragedy." She looked down at the documents, her hazel eyes scanning his signature one last time. Then she deliberately gripped the edges of the thick paper and tore them in half. The sound of the tearing vellum echoed like a gunshot in the quiet library. Owen flinched violently, stepping forward. "What are you doing?" "Reclaiming my narrative," Arya said. She tossed the torn halves onto the mahogany table. They slid to a stop against the inkwell. She looked up at him, her chin held high, her eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying light. "I am not Arya Penelope." Arya Penelope was a terrified blind girl who let her father sell her to a coward. She stepped around the table. She closed the distance between them until she was standing inches away, forcing him to look down into her eyes. "I am the Duchess of Rotham," she said softly. "I paid for that title with a year of darkness and a lifetime of scars, and I am going to keep it." Owen's mind reeled. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "Arya, you hate me. You cannot bear the sight of me." "I despise what you did," she corrected, her gaze unwavering. "And I do not forgive you. Do not mistake this for a romance, Owen. I am not swooning into your arms. You do not get a neat, tidy redemption where the wife smiles and pats your hand." "Then why?" he pleaded, entirely out of his depth, completely at her mercy. "Because a coward ran from me in the dark," she said, reaching out. Her bare fingers brushed the lapel of his jacket. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a shock wave straight through his bones. "But a man came to me in the light, handed me a knife, and bared his own throat. I want to see what that man does next." Owen looked down at her. She was not a ghost anymore. She was real, she was terrifying, and she was entirely in control. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice shaking. Arya dropped her hand from his chest. She turned toward the doorway, looking out into the bustling hallway, where the servants were carrying trunks. "I am going to the country," she said. "The air in London is foul. You are going to manage your estate. You are going to pay back every cent my father gave you, not to my solicitors, but into the duchy's accounts. You are going to rebuild the ruin you made." She paused at the threshold, turning her head slightly to look back at him over her shoulder. The pale light caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone. "And when you have done that," Arya said, the faintest ghost of a smile touching the corner of her mouth, "you may call on me. We will take a walk in the gardens, in the daylight." She stepped out into the hall, leaving the torn papers on the desk. Owen stood in the quiet library, listening to the steady, unhesitating sound of her footsteps fading away. He looked at the ruined annulment, and for the first time in 3 years, he took a full, deep breath. He had a great deal of work to do. Some scars don't fade. They just become the foundation we build upon. Owen and Arya's story isn't about easy forgiveness. It's about the brutal, beautiful work of choosing each other in the light. If this deeply human tale of brokenness and redemption kept you captivated, please hit the like button, share it with fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more grounded, emotional dramas. What did you think of Arya's final choice? Let us know in the comments.